So I will introduce myself. I'm Adina Vogel-Ayalon. I'm J Street's Chief of Staff, and we're here to spend the next hour together to learn more about J Street. And for anyone who is not here today, we will be recording this discussion and able to send this out as well. If you are a longtime J Street leader and supporter, this probably isn't the forum for you. We will keep this discussion at the 30,000-foot level to be able to introduce J Street to our newest supporters and people that are just getting to know us. We've seen recently a sincere uptick in interest by many who are starting to look at J Street for the first time. We are seeing this very much as a result of the critical moment that we are in for the future of the state of Israel as we know it, also very much a critical moment for the future of the US-Israel relationship that we at J Street care so deeply about. This is a relationship, of course, that we would like to see truly reflecting our values and the values of the majority of the American Jewish community and the broader community in the United States that cares deeply about peace and democracy. So over the next hour, we will provide some background about who we are and what we do. We will have time for questions, so please do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. We look forward to getting to them at the end of the discussion. I'm going to turn it over now to Jeremy, J Street's founder and president. And Jeremy, I'm going to ask you to tell us what led you to establish J Street 15 years ago.
Thanks so much, Adina, and welcome to what I hope are hundreds of folks who are going to be watching this discussion over the course of the coming days and weeks and learning a little bit more about J Street. And as you said, it's just been really extraordinary to see the level of interest that we have found over the last few weeks as Israel has been really grappling with some of the most important challenges of its history. And we'll be talking about those challenges more explicitly and the current constitutional crisis due to the lack of a constitution in Israel. But let me start at the beginning, which is really what is the mission, what is the reason why J Street exists in the first place. And it goes back now about 15 or 20 years to a desire to create a voice in the American discussion that might be the policy discussion or the political discussion or American Jewish communal discussion about Israel. For those of us who share a set of values and a worldview that is based on a set of core principles that haven't changed since the day we launched. The very first principle of J Street is that we're a group of people who care very deeply about Israel. We may not live there, although Adina, you lived there for 10 years. I lived there for many years. Jonathan, you've lived there for some time. We are people who care very deeply about the people of Israel. We have relatives and friends and family who live there. And we embody the notion of what it means to be pro-Israel in the sense that we really care deeply about what happens to the state and to the people and how it impacts not only their lives, but also our lives as Jews here in the United States. So we're a pro-Israel organization as our first principle. But I think secondly, we said for too long, people have looked at this as a zero-sum game. If you're pro-Israel, then you have to be anti-something. And we said, we're the pro-Israel part of the community that's also pro-Palestinian in the sense that we recognize that the Palestinian people have a parallel set of rights. Those are individual human rights, but they're also a collective right. The Jewish people have a collective right to self-determination in the land of Israel. The Palestinian people have a collective right to their own self-determination in the exact same land, which is the source of the underlying conflict. And so our second core principle was a belief that to be pro-Israel meant that one also had to support the underlying rights of the other people who live there and to work towards a resolution of the conflict between those two peoples that is peaceful, that is negotiated, that is diplomatic, and that results in the rights of both peoples being fulfilled and respected. And we became associated with the concept of a two-state solution as the only way out of this mess from day one. The two-state solution is further away, unfortunately, today than it was when we launched. but it doesn't mean that anybody's come up with a better idea about how you actually get out of this conflict. So that's our second core principle, is that we're not we're actually pro-Palestinian as well as pro-Israel, and we're pro-peace and pro-diplomacy, and want to see this conflict resolved. Our third principle as Americans related to what's the role of the United States in all of this. And one version of pro-Israel for many decades had been the only way that you can be supportive of the state of Israel in the United States is to simply support whatever it is that the government of Israel is doing, right or wrong, that you're not allowed to criticize. And we said, no, our definition of pro-Israel is that you need to be able to stand up and say what you think about these issues, and actually perhaps criticism of what the state of Israel or the government of Israel may be doing. Maybe that's the right approach, and to say that publicly and urge U.S. policy where it needs to press Israel and to press Palestinians to move in different directions so that we can put conflict behind us and not deepen those conflicts. And I think that concept that being pro-Israel incorporates the right and sometimes the obligation and responsibility to criticize, that's come into very clear resolution, I think, in these last weeks, as such a large swath of Jewish America has suddenly said, wait a minute, I can't believe what's happening over there. And this government is made up of a bunch of people that I can't relate to, and they're doing things that seem to run counter to my fundamental beliefs. And the notion that you can be pro-Israel and care deeply about the people in the country and criticize and not agree with the government, I think that as one of our core founding principles is suddenly bursting into the mainstream here. We said not only do we have an interest in what the government is doing and the politicians are doing about all of this, but in our own Jewish community, having a good old-fashioned argument about all of this is actually pretty healthy. And so our fourth core principle was we wanted to encourage and try to facilitate and open up the space for a robust and vibrant discussion, hopefully civil debate about what's going on in Israel and what's the appropriate American policy and how should we all be relating. And that conversation too often in our community, people are afraid of it and they try to shut it down. And if somebody's going to bring a Palestinian voice into the discussion or criticize the policies of the state of Israel, people want to close the doors of the Hillel or close the doors of a synagogue and say that's not to be heard in our community. And we said that's really bad. That's unhealthy for our community to shut down debate. It's not very Jewish, certainly not democratic. And we want to have an open, healthy, vibrant conversation, even if we don't agree. And that's good for our community, and it's good for the future health of the American Jewish community. And then finally, and I'll stop here in terms of the sort of core principles of J Street, we said we as American Jews have an identity that is pretty deeply rooted in a set of values that we then pass on to our kids and to our grandkids. And it's a sense of pursuing justice as the core of Judaism. It's the idea that you don't treat other people the way you wouldn't want to be treated yourself. It's a recognition that the Jewish people have been oppressed and have been victims of oppressive regimes where they've lived over the centuries and millennia. And as an oppressed people that has a finely tuned radar for justice, that's become sort of the central piece of our identity. And we've become real pillars of fighting for civil rights of others, for minority rights, protecting democracy, ensuring the separation of religion and state. These are very core parts of our identity here, and those are our core values. And we're proud of them, and that's how we define our identity. And if those are our values, then we have to stand up for those values when it comes to the state of the Jewish people as well. And if some of those values are being violated by the way in which Israel is acting, its government is acting, the policies, particularly vis-a-vis the Palestinians, you don't treat other people the way you didn't want to be treated yourself, is not the way that we're approaching the Palestinian non-citizens of Israel under what is happening on the West Bank and in Gaza. And so we said we've got to apply those same values across the board. And those are the founding principles of J Street. We care deeply about Israel. We care about the Palestinian people. We want a two-state resolution ultimately to this conflict. U.S. policy should try to resolve conflicts, not just be Israel right or wrong. We need to have these open debates in our community, and we need to be true to the values that if we really believe them, they have to apply to everything that we do. So that's sort of who we are and what we have stood for from the beginning. I wanted to now shift and give you a chance to say a few words about the current moment and tell folks a little bit about this crisis. I mean, I assume people who are tuning into this are somewhat following what's going on, but perhaps you could lay out a bit what are the stakes of the moment as Israel approaches its 75th birthday.
Happy to. I think you referenced specifically this constitutional crisis without a constitution. So I will start by saying this since this government, which is I would say the most right-wing government, not just me, this is what is being said, the most right-wing government in Israel's history has come into office. We have seen how their political agenda has brought about one of the most significant national crises for the state of Israel since its founding. And this crisis is on several fronts. The first front, I would say, is the real threat to the core foundations of Israel's democracy through the judicial reforms that this government is calling them judicial reforms, that this government is trying to push. I'm not going to go into the detail of what are the reforms. There's a lot of minutia here, but the most important thing is that these reforms and the pieces of legislation that have been presented by this government are so significant that they have brought hundreds of thousands of Israelis out into the streets. Israelis from across the political spectrum, Israelis from across society, Jews and Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. And it's led to things that we have thought to be unprecedented in terms of Israeli opposition to actions that are being taken by the government. One example is Israeli Defense Force, Israeli Air Force reservists declaring that they won't show up for duty, pushing Israeli tech and venture capital companies to move their assets out of the country. And we are hearing constantly more and more voices from sectors throughout the country that are really sounding the alarm bells about the real threat that these reforms pose to the democratic foundations of the state of Israel. So that's one front, which is these threats to democracy. The second front of this national crisis is in the vein of Jewish pluralism. This government includes ultra-Orthodox and religious Zionist parties that are seeking to redefine the way that Jewish people both in Israel and outside of Israel have a connection to the state of Israel. And this is directly impacting how diaspora Jewry is able to relate to Israel at this moment, which is incredibly significant for a country that is to be the homeland of the Jewish people. And the third front is on security, and specifically the conflict with Palestinians. This government has taken concrete steps towards annexation of the West Bank, further entrenching the conflict, moving us further away from a potential resolution to the conflict. We are seeing a steady flow of violence in the West Bank that is seeping into Israel, continuous incursions by Israeli forces into Palestinian cities due to a decline in a real effective Israeli-Palestinian security coordination, terrorist attacks. This is a moment that has been significant on the radar of the United States. They are seeking very much to try to lower the tensions, but it is very clear that on all three fronts, this government has brought about an incredible crisis for the state of Israel and the stability of the state of Israel. And the Supreme Court, which is the focus of these judicial reforms, is an obstacle for this government on all of these fronts. There is a very clear link between what this government is trying to propose as judicial reforms and what they are trying to do on the conflict front and over the West Bank. The Supreme Court has been viewed as an obstacle for their political agenda. And that is, I think, a very important distinction, is that this is not just threats to democracy internally in Israel on inside the Green Line, but that this government is seeking to propose judicial reforms so that they can enact policies that have a very clear impact over the Green Line. So with that sort of brief summary of the three different fronts and the threats, Jeremy, I want to turn it back over to you to talk about how J Street is responding to this moment. You did mention, of course, that there are organizations, other American Jewish organizations, and this is a moment in which people are finally realizing you can be supportive and very pro-Israel and also be critical of the actions of this government. Can you talk about how we are differentiated from other organizations, specifically at this time and also more broadly?
So I think the first and most important distinction about J Street and what it does is that we are a political advocacy organization. And so the address for our concerns has always been America's policymakers, its elected officials, its politicians, and to represent to those people the views of the majority of the American Jewish community. And so our role in this moment is to be a voice to Washington, D.C., to members of Congress, to the White House, that is saying the majority of Jewish Americans are deeply, deeply not only concerned, I think concern doesn't even begin to get at it, really oppose the kinds of things that are being proposed by this government of Israel. We are not at all comfortable with the idea that the United States would just stand by quietly and let this happen without a peep. And so our number one activity that we do always, but even more so in this moment, is our lobbying and our advocacy to elected officials and to policymakers in Washington to say, please go on record publicly and clearly and loudly with the opposition of the United States to the things that are being proposed, and take some meaningful actions. Don't just have words and phrases, but actually take some action. So for instance, just yesterday, the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, took the unprecedented step of sort of calling in the Israeli ambassador to make very clear that the United States considered the law that was just passed yesterday in the Knesset, repealing the 2005 disengagement law, which was a Ariel Sharon era law saying that Israelis are not allowed to settle in certain areas of the West Bank. They repealed that yesterday. And that was a commitment not only of the Israeli government of Ariel Sharon, but it was a commitment of just 3 weeks ago by this Israeli government to not do steps like this. And so, we're trying to push the administration to do more along those lines. Last week, 92 members of the House of Representatives sent a letter to President Biden that said, please use all diplomatic tools to oppose what is happening in Israel, whether it's on that democracy front and the question of judicial reforms, or it is on the front of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and making it no longer possible to see a way to a conflict resolution and to separating into two states ultimately. So those are the kinds of things that we do. We press for policy. We urge members of Congress to use their bully pulpit to press as well. And we organize in our communities. And so, Jonathan, I know you've been sort of on the front lines in some of the community organizing that we've been doing. I know you've been a speaker at some of the protests that have been going on. And you can perhaps, this is an audience of folks who are somewhat new to J Street, and maybe from the perspective of a J Street leader, you can tell us a little bit about your experience and your background and what you've seen as the ability to get involved in J Street.
Happy to do that. Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Adina, and welcome to everyone who's joined this call and will tune in to subsequent calls. I live in New York City. My name's Jonathan Kopp, and I grew up in the suburbs of New York. I was always very politically active, volunteering on campaigns as a kid, and then I went into politics professionally. And this is actually a spoiler alert. That's where I first met Jeremy. Was on the 1992 Clinton campaign for president. So it goes back a ways, but I was a political operative, political activist, and at the same time, I I grew up with a very strong Jewish identity. It was a very important part of my family life, my community life. And as an exchange student, I had lived with a family in Israel during part of my teenage years. So here I was, this very active political person and very connected to my Judaism and Israel. And yet I never was involved in Israel politics, not in the US about policy and politics as it relates to Israel, and not in domestically within Israel. And that divide never really occurred to me and didn't bother me. There were two separate parts of my life. And then it was April or May of 2008, and I heard through mutual friends from our old Clinton days that Jeremy had started J Street. And when I heard about this, like my head exploded, because I didn't even realize that there was this void in my life that connected my political corridor and my Jewish Israel corridor. But what I realized when I heard about J Street was that all of my life, I heard people who claimed to be the leaders of American Jewry, but they never felt like they were speaking for me. They never felt like they were speaking to me. And so it was just kind of white noise in the background. When I heard that there was a way to be a progressive American who cares about Israel, who supports Israel, but from the left with progressive values and Jewish values, I quickly called up Jeremy and I said, what can I do? How can I get involved? I'm in New York. I left DC, but this is important to me. And the opportunity came up to join with the nascent New York chapter. And there are chapters in markets all around the country. And so I got in touch with the folks who were getting things started here in New York. And I said, put me in. How can I get involved? What can I do? And immediately, I hosted a house party. In fact, I got my rabbi to host a house party, which was even better because, clergy bring a certain amount of gravitas and authority. And so we hosted a house party to say, come, if you're interested in Israel, if you're interested in policy and politics around Israel, come join and let's hear more about J Street and what you can do. And that's something that any of you can do. You can host a house party. You can find out about house parties near you and start to learn more and get other people to learn more as well. In addition, very quickly, I joined what we call an in-district meeting. And so one of the ways that J Street intersects with our members of Congress is we go meet with them. And you can bet that other Jewish groups are also meeting with those members of Congress. They need to hear from us. And so J Street staff and lay leaders around the country help organize in-district meetings with members of the House, members of the Senate. We go in as a group of constituents. We say, we're here as J Street supporters. We've got real concerns about what's happening in Israel. And we want to let you know where we're coming from and why, and how we'd like you to represent us in Congress if you want to be involved in Israel. So in-district meetings, a great way to get involved, really exciting too, and very interesting. And you see the results, like the letter that Jeremy referenced of 92 signers. That happens through direct person-to-person contact and interaction by J Street supporters in markets around the country going to meet with their members of Congress. There are other ways you can get involved as well. We have synagogue liaisons. So if you belong to a synagogue, some synagogues are more political, some are not. But surely enough, there are probably some members of your synagogue who are predisposed to share your views on Israel. Meeting up with those other members, finding out what their interest is, getting them involved, building relationships through synagogues is a great way to be involved with J Street, support us, and get the word out and continue to build support. And then, of course, there's a lot of programming that goes on. We have speakers and films and panels and conversations like this, live and on the web. And so there's a constant steady stream of information, content, engagement, programming, and ways to get involved. And I'll say one more, which is, of course, we are a political advocacy organization and we try to build political will. So we have a PAC, a political action committee, and political giving is another way that you can get involved as well. Writing checks to members, making sure that they understand this comes from a J Street supporter. And that's where this money is coming from. And that's the point of view that's expressed. That's another of so many ways that you can get involved. And for me, it's been incredibly gratifying and satisfying. Since 2008, and it just continues to grow and deepen, and the connection with other Jewish Americans who care about Israel is a very important part of my life, and at such an important time in the life of Jewish Americans and Israel. What we're going to do right now is we're going to put a questionnaire, a link to a questionnaire in the chat. And that is going to give you an opportunity where you can fill it out. You can let us know how you might like to get involved in the movement. And once you do, indicate the things that you're interested in, someone from J Street will follow up with you to make sure that you can get plugged in your network, in your locality, and ultimately nationally. It's a great community, and we invite as many people who are interested in joining as possible.
I want to, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for sharing all of that. I want to invite our viewers to ask your questions, put some questions in the Q&A, and because we are really looking forward to hearing what's on your minds and answering your questions. I will start with the one question. Just Jeremy, this one is for you. I would love for you to reflect on where we were 15 years ago and where we are today. What would you think is the most significant defining factor or factors that distinguish from what we were in 2008 to 2023?
So I think it's interesting how the things that we stand for are the exact same. We really, the principles and the values that we hold are the same, but the world around us has changed so much, so radically. I think one thing that has happened in the United States is when we started saying the things we were saying, we were considered radical. Somehow this idea of breaking the consensus of everybody's supposed to just be quiet and line up quietly behind whatever's happening and it's okay, saying that that's not okay was radical. The things that we were saying were not particularly radical. I always felt from the beginning that we were a relatively moderate group, and that the things we were saying represented the 50-yard line of the American Jewish community. But just the fact that we were breaking the silence and breaking the consensus made it seem out there. And I think today there's a very, very vibrant spectrum of opinion on these issues that runs from way to our left politically to way to our right. I think that the conversation is a lot more robust, and there are many, many more groups and organizations and voices out there. And so I think that's a big change, that we are now squarely in the middle. There's no question. There's a very wonderfully vibrant pro-Palestinian left, to our left, that doesn't express a whole lot of sympathy for Israel, and is very uncomfortable with the notion of a pro-Israel discourse. And so that's sort of defining some of the progressive left spaces. And the right wing, unfortunately, has gotten even more radically right wing, and their anti-Palestinianism. I mean, you just see what some of the Israeli ministers are saying about Palestinian people, and they're being welcomed in the United States for selling Israel bonds even, which is astonishing. But the right and the left are out there. They're establishing their polls, and that was not the case so much. And I think that people do look at what we're saying these days as pretty centrist and pretty much the mainstream of the American Jewish community. And at the same time, I'd say the situation on the ground in Israel-Palestine, in that area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, has gotten a lot worse in the 15 years of J Street. I think that if you remember 2008, George W. Bush was president. We were in the middle of the Annapolis peace talks. Condoleezza Rice was shuttling back and forth between Abbas and Ehud Olmert. And they were this close to actually having a peace agreement. And when J Street was launched, that was the atmosphere. We just need some political support, some political space in this country to help get that over the line. A Republican president, a Republican secretary of state, and that is inconceivable 15 years later, right? The whole environment on the ground has become so polarized and so violent and so extreme, and people doubt that there's any way to get to a two-state solution today as opposed to 15 years ago when we were this close. So my view is that nothing is ever set in stone, and just as it was not guaranteed 15 years ago that we were going to get there, it is not guaranteed today that we're never going to get there. This is a epic story over the course of generations and history, and we're fighting some really entrenched battles and some entrenched forces that we're not going to judge our success overnight, let's say. So I think the situation has changed dramatically in many ways since we launched, yet I feel that we remain very much true to the values and the positions that we held from the beginning.
Thanks, Jeremy. So sort of following up on that last point, we have a question here about giving the increasing numbers of Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, and settlers, other settlers in the West Bank, how is it possible to be actually optimistic about the long-term situation in Israel?
Well, it's one of my favorite questions because I have this dispute with people about the concept of optimism, which is essentially, is it a passive thing that you just sort of sit back and wait for good things to happen, or do you actually have to create your hope and create the conditions that lead you to optimism? And I think the work of advocates for justice and for equality and for peace and for all good things, the work is very active work, and usually it's a pretty uphill fight against some pretty long odds, and you create hope, you build it. As President Obama liked to quote Martin Luther King, you bend the long arc of history towards justice. It needs to have that. It needs to have that active hand on it to pull it in the right direction. And that's the same thing with the situation today. There are a lot of reasons why one can cite analytically that things are not heading in the right direction, but there's a difference between analysis and advocacy, and there's a difference between just sort of passively hoping that things will get better and actively working to make them better. And that's what J Street is. We're the active creators of optimism, and we're the creators of hope, and hopefully setting a good example for our community and for our kids, and understanding what it looks like to fight for the things that are important that we believe in.
So on that note of setting a good example, I think this question can be for both of you, Jonathan and Jeremy. Do we try as J Street to connect with younger generations, like college students?
I'll be happy to start out. And I'm sure
only
Dina,
at
Jeremy,
Tufts. We only connect to them at Tufts.
So both Jeremy and my daughters are at Tufts, and my daughter happens to be a chair of the J Street U chapter. So we have university students at campuses across the country who have organized on campus around the same position as J Street, but tailored to a university audience. I think the dynamics that are going on college campuses right now are different than some of the cross currents that we're dealing with in the adult world, J Street Big, as we like to call it. And on campuses, there's a loud, active protest by the Students for Justice in Palestine groups, and there's a loud pushback from the right, from the more Israel right or wrong students on the right. And J Street, for a lot of college students, creates a space in the middle between those extremes where there's a lot of shouting at each other and calling names and disruptive protests. And J Street says, you know what, these are complicated issues. They're not black and white. There's a lot of gray. Let's come talk and let's be constructive and let's build some relationships. It's not easy. They get a lot of pushback that from the left, that they're not far left enough and critical enough, from the right that they're not holding the line of defending Israel enough. But that's the space that J Street occupies. No pun intended at all. But that is the space where J Street lives. And for students, we provide that safety for them that is between those poles.
Thanks, Jonathan. Jeremy, is there anything you'd like to add about J Street U and our vision for engaging the younger generations?
Well, I do think that it's important to recognize that J Street does a lot more than just the advocacy work that I was focusing on earlier, and Jonathan mentioned, and our work on campuses is a part of it. We also are very actively organizing clergy who need a community as well of support to figure out how to deal with this issue in their synagogues and in their communities. And we have over 1,000 rabbis now, and rabbis and cantors, since both Adina and I have relatives who are cantors, rabbis and cantors in our clergy cabinet. And that is another example of our work. We do education work in the sense of taking people to Israel and Palestine and seeing the realities on the ground. We take members of Congress, congressional staff, policymakers, other influential folks. So there's a lot of education work, a lot of briefings that we do. And so it's not just that J Street U is another important part of our work. It's that we have a whole broad education agenda and a vision of what we hope we'll be able to achieve over the course of these coming years related to Israel education. I think there was a question in the chat about having learned one narrative growing up. And I think all of us, whatever generation we're in, even our kids, got a certain narrative in Sunday schools, in day schools, in camps, and any form of Jewish communal institution that we were a part of about the creation of the state of Israel. And it never included the Palestinian narrative. And it wasn't until I lived in Israel and studied Hebrew in an Ulpan with Palestinians that I began to actually hear their story and understand who they were. And so I think the idea of Israel education and how to provide a more balanced entry into these conversations for young people is critical. And we're going to do some thinking with J Street U about that over the course of the coming years. And how can college students actually go back to their high schools and their Sunday schools and their camps and help to prepare in a more balanced and nuanced and thoughtful manner the next generation, so that when they arrive on college campus, they're a little bit better prepared than our kids were for these conversations.
Thank you both. So the question that followed, the comment about narrative and understanding the other narrative, and I very much identify with what was noted here and what you reflected on, Jeremy. Very much, wish that when
your experience too, yeah, you should.
That's my experience. Yes, that is my experience. Being a product of the Jewish institutions, which were excellent and still are excellent institutions, but the Israel education was very firmly in one narrative. I do think there are shifts that are happening now in the American Jewish community, but there's still a long way to go in terms of really providing opportunities to have exposure to nuanced narratives. But so the question here is, does J Street have experience working with peace-seeking Palestinian organizations?
And the short answer is yes. I mean, there are a lot of Palestinians, particularly Palestinians who actually live in Palestine, who we work closely with. I think that what happens to diaspora communities sometimes is they become a little bit more radical than the people living there, or a little bit less willing to criticize or take, stances that could be seen critically. And so, I do think that when it comes to the Palestinian rights movement in the United States in 2023, it's firmly in a camp, let's say the BDS movement or other organizations that take a very, very hard, and I think correctly so, pro-human rights view. There's often little in the rhetoric or the positioning of those organizations that is provides an opening to the Jewish community and to the pro-Israel community. We say we're pro-Israel and pro-Palestine, right? We want to see both peoples get their rights, and that's both individual and collective rights. I think we're finding it harder and harder to find partners on the Palestinian side because the situation is so bad. It's understandable. But in order for us to work with organizations, they need to recognize the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination in the land of Israel. They need to be able to recognize a parallel set of commitments and rights that we recognize. And that does sometimes pose some difficulties. So there are plenty of wonderful organizations and there are plenty of individuals that we can work with, but I will also say that we have our lines, and one of our lines is that you really do have to be willing to acknowledge the right of the Jewish people to have a state as well, as long as that state is, democratic and treats everybody well and equally. But that, sometimes can be a barrier to some of those cooperative efforts.
Thanks. And I'll move on to the next question. You referenced our engagement with Jewish clergy, as we are a predominantly Jewish organization, but not exclusively. Do we reach out to Christian clergy and lay people?
Absolutely. I mean, again, we work in partnership with many, many organizations. Some of them have zero religious or communal affiliations. They're just policy organizations, or they're pro-peace, or they're anti-nuclear proliferation, or, there's a vibrant community out there of groups that work for peace and diplomacy and justice and a better foreign policy and, global denuclearization and, all sorts of good stuff out there. So we have lots and lots of partners. J Street itself, we say we are primarily, but not exclusively Jewish. I think the problem that we were created to solve is the problem that policymakers and politicians misunderstood where the Jewish community falls on these issues. And so to solve that problem, we need to be an authentically, primarily, though not exclusively, Jewish voice. And we need to show people not that the non-Jewish community feels a certain way. We need to show them that the Jewish community feels a certain way. So we have a definite higher level of engagement with the Jewish community and with Jewish clergy and others in the institutional Jewish world, but we work in partnership and closely with a number of different faith-based groups in the Muslim community and in the Christian community that are working towards peace and conflict resolution. And Michael, Goldstein, I see in the chat, pointed out as well that there are a number of organizations that are Israeli-Palestinian, that are cooperative, that try to foster dialogue and, bring people together at a grassroots level. They might be slightly political, like let's say a Standing Together type of organization, or they might be purely about creating a musical environment or a health program that brings Israelis and Palestinians together. And we support that very strongly. And one of the things we lobby for is financial support from the United States for organizations like that.
Thank you so much. I want to remind folks that you should please fill out the questionnaire in the chat because we would love to know how you would be interested in getting involved with J Street. And we are, of course, interested in any further questions that you might have, happy to answer and be in touch with you and in conversation with you. Anything, Jonathan or Jeremy, that you would like to add as a final word to our viewers?
For me, this is a organization and movement building moment. People are thinking about these issues. People are reading about them. They're talking about them. Seders are coming up, and everybody's going to argue about these issues at their Seder table. And so, anybody who does see this Zoom and has the link, please do pass it along to your friends, to your family. Tell one more person about J Street and pass this along so they can get engaged and involved. We need to build some momentum at this really critical moment to show that the majority of Jewish Americans do value democracy, both here and in Israel. We value justice. We don't want to see what is happening between Israelis and Palestinians continue, and we need to build that movement by passing the word along to people who share our values. So join us.
And I'll just add that you can't underestimate the power that each of you as an individual has when we're part of this J Street movement. We hear it directly from members of Congress, from members of Knesset in Israel, that this is the time, this is the moment when they need American Jews to come and speak out. They're looking for it, they're begging for it. They need, the American policymakers need both direction and support, and the members of Knesset and the Israeli citizens are asking for their brothers and sisters or cousins here in America to step up, to speak out, and to get involved. And so really, for each and every one of you, there's a very important opportunity to get involved, and to lend your voice.
Thanks, Adina.
Thank you. Thank you both. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to chat with you online. But thank you everyone for being here. And yes, as was noted, please do join us and make your voice heard as part of our movement. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.